Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 2nd of November in the 44th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misrepresented, maybe even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Next week, the American electorate will choose a new president, 1/3 of the U.S. Senate, and a new House of Representatives. But, perhaps surprisingly, there's not much mystery about what these people will do in office. We saw that in 2008, a contentious election led to an astonishing continuity in policy. The peace candidate got a peace prize and then tripled the size of the war. Obama has continued to expand it while still contending that he's not. And he also expanded the Bush administration's bank bailouts for the 1%. Without establishing a jobs program, for example, for the 99%. So it seems that we are in a position tonight to discuss the outcome of next week's election insofar as policy is concerned. In America, policy is insulated from politics. So you're watching News from Neptune, the election results edition. In ancient Rome, an auspicium, was literally one who looks at birds, a diviner or augur who read omens from the observed flight of birds. In the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War, Calchas was the bird diviner to Agamemnon, the Greek general. An augur would perform a ceremony known as taking the auspices and would read flight patterns of birds in the sky for hints about the future. Depending upon the birds, the auspices from the gods could be favorable or unfavorable, that is, auspicious or inauspicious. In Republican Rome, sometimes bribed or politically motivated augurs would fabricate unfavorable auspices in order to delay certain state functions, such as elections. But I think we're in a pretty good place to read the auspices and predict the future for U.S. policy, including plans for 10 more years of drones that were announced quietly last week. The birds we're watching turn out to be mostly mechanical. And Ron Szoke will flip the first bird, so to speak.
Okay, well, again, the degenerate state of political discussion and debate has impressed me last week. Whether it will improve any more after November 6th, I'm not sure. But let me make one last comment about it. So much of it is devoted to simply insults, accusations, name-calling, and so on. In part, well, we have this notion that politics is something to do with Republicans versus Democrats. And that's the narrow and degenerate form that political has for us, apparently. We've come a long way from Plato and Aristotle talking about the policies, the laws, and principles of the polity. When Aristotle says that man is a political animal, politikon zoon, he means an organism that lives in organized communities. And we have a lot of trouble learning to do that and coming up with some scheme of organization, some set of rules and social principles that will prevent us from constantly colliding with each other and fighting with each other and exploiting each other and so on. So that's what it's all about. Our favorite accusation is that somebody has been politicizing something. And, I hope they have been in most cases, such as Hurricane Sandy. Again, this involves a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on in politics. And that is, to me, trying to implement the rules, values, principles under which we should live. And that's what I mean by political, and it pervades all of life. So if one politician accuses another of playing politics with something, I say, sure, of course, that's what they're doing, that's what they should be doing. But anyway, why am I going on like this?
The question of the day.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I wanted to revert to a old theme of mine, and that is how do we produce a better society, a better polity for us to live in. And I take it that the three people here are wanting to aspire to be reformers in some sense. They think we should go forward, make some progress in society, live in a somewhat different society than the one we do now, one that will be more egalitarian, less exploitative, and so on. So this reminded me again of one of my favorite books of many years ago, James Harvey Robinson, the progressive historian at Columbia University for many years, whose little book of 1921, The Mind in the Making, I keep going back to from time to time. And it's a good thing, I think, for a lot of people to read, especially young people. Its main defect, I think, today is that he's too much impressed by the Freudianism that was popular among intellectuals right after World War I. They viewed it as a terrifically liberating thing, but I no longer think that it is. Anyway, his thesis is to critique and offer an alternative to what he calls three disappointed methods of reform. Changes in the rules of the game, some kind of structural change will do it, or there ought to be a law, or something else of the kind. And he has some eloquent words about that. I think he's mostly right. Second disappointed method of reform is spiritual exhortation, moral uplift, lecturing people about the need for brotherly love. Our president has done this from time to time and talking about the fact that we're all in this together, which is true, but what does it mean exactly? We don't know. This is the insight that we all think, I think, need to acquire, is that the extent to which we owe each other and draw all of our ideas about how people ought to live from the ongoing society, including the radical individualists, that kind of individualism that you find in Ayn Rand and a number of other libertarian writers, would never have occurred to anyone if they didn't draw it from the culture and the society that surrounds them. So even extreme individualism, the notion of individual sovereignty, is actually a social product in my view. The third and last disappointed method of reform he talks about is education. And we tend to equate this with years of attending schools and colleges and acquiring credentials and so on. And that is, in the longer run, always a disappointment, it seems to me. People, this is a favorite thesis of mine, if people understood what education really is, involving critical thinking and a more comprehensive view of things, they would be against it. They would declare it subversive and try to get the teacher fired or executed or whatever, as they did with Socrates and Jesus. So I think those who talk about education as being a cure to our social ills and a path to progress or method of reform are disappointed in the longer run. Let me suggest a couple of others that have their limitations also. We hear about education a lot among nice, liberal, high-minded people. Another one we hear a lot about is leadership and what we must call, I suppose, salesmanship. So we're hearing that Obama or this person or that candidate has failed to provide leadership, and this is equated with salesmanship. They didn't sell their particular policy, whatever it was, legislative measure. Another method of reform is toughness and coercion, bullying people, talking tough, acting tough, letting people know that you're going to break heads or kick behinds if people don't start shaping up and doing what they should do. Another defective path to reform is what we might call bribery and incentives, and in effect paying people off to do what they should do. This is something often resorted to as a way of trying to reform the behavior of children. Endless debate about whether they should be paid to get good grades or do household chores or whatever. And again, it usually turns out to be very disappointing. What Robinson proposes, and I think is the only real way, is intelligent, insightful social action. But if you want to make any lasting reform, you have to persuade people that what you're suggesting is the better way, and not only will it be good for them in the longer run, but it'll be better for everyone. So I would then suggest finally some political maxims to keep in mind as we reach the end of this hysterically political campaign season. A slogan is not a policy, one that I proposed here before. Attempts to implement any particular slogan quickly run into lots of problems that make life complicated for people. I'm not a great believer in condemning all politicians as being corrupt and evil and degenerate and disgusting. Some of them really try to implement things that they think would be good for the entire social order. They're often frustrated in their attempts to do this and have to fall back upon some less than admirable behavior. Point 2, political maximum: policy cannot be based on atrocity stories alone. So if your approach to political discussion is telling horror stories about what the other side did, or you think they did, or you accuse them of doing, I think that's utterly futile, and I generally ignore it. Third point, our political thinking and other kinds of thinking are generally crippled by what I would call premature moralism, moralistic browbeating of people, hectoring, bully-ragging, efforts to induce guilt, name-calling, insults, accusations, and so on, of which we've had a bellyful recently. And again, you can sometimes succeed making people feel guilty in the long run by accusing them of this and that and so on, but it never lasts very long, and you're not going to produce any positive change in people's behavior in the long run by doing that, it seems to me. So there, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. To my amazement, I agree with most of what you said today, more than usual, actually, and want to argue only with about the last third. So, but I'll let David have a crack first.
Well, my question would be, in light of what you said, where is it that political science has gotten us? What is your view of the field or discipline, alleged discipline of political science, and why does it seem that it doesn't really relate to everything that you've said.
Well, that's because on the one hand, it tries to turn the study of political matters or government into a science, which means something that's objective and can, in the sense that it can be agreed upon intersubjectively. And on the other hand, the notion, and all of the social sciences, as it's called, or social studies, are troubled by this same split between the attempt to make it scientific, and on the one hand, and on the other, the realization that this is not getting at the real issue of how people view things and feel about them, and so on. It's happened in psychology between the rat runners and the psychological counseling people. It happened in sociology. Some of the most insightful and best sociology, it seems to me, is in the tradition of Willard Waller and Irving Goffman and so on, looking at things from inside the social actor's point of view and how they perceive things. And can those be brought together, I think? And that's the ideal, it seems to me, to bring them together in some productive interaction, the objective with the subjective, and so on. The perceptual, symbolic interactionist view with the statisticians and demographers, and so on. That's difficult to do, but can we develop some mid-range theories that will mediate that kind of difference, as Robert Merton seemed to want? I don't know. But the same thing bedevils politics. Will there be political science? Well, I don't know. We need to also look at things from the standpoint of the citizen and how he or she perceives things and their feelings about what's going on. But they will have their own opinions about all of that, how it plays upon their own subjectivity. The problem is that people don't often realize the limitations of their own opinions, and they try to impose those on others in a way that's unethical and seems to be undesirable. But anyway.
The old remark is that political science is to science as military music is to music, right? Not much science, perhaps.
Or military intelligence, right? Oxymoron.
Right.
I guess the thing that reoccurs in a way when I look at how these things are played out in the media is that people are led to feel that there are strict limits on their right to govern themselves. I mean, in the freest and allegedly most democratic country in the world, of course, I don't agree with the latter, but still, it's amazing how often people are told that governing themselves, that our efforts to govern ourselves are very limited, that most of them are doomed, and Ron, you point out some good reasons why they might be doomed, but our educational system has done a terrible job of helping people to understand what their power as citizens might be, because it's so busy telling them that the market governs this, or interest groups govern that, or your rights, their rights, nature, the market. All of these things prevent people from developing a sense of empowerment, and that at a social level, we actually can determine within some limits, especially environmental limits and limits of quote-unquote human nature, but that there are real choices to be made in what kind of society we want to have, and we have a right to make them, given, again, limits on the rights. I mean, we don't have the right, the majority doesn't have the right to decide that the minority ought to be imprisoned or worse. But still, we are constantly coming up against these sort of explicit and implicit roadblocks into what we as a society might do.
This is a conjunction of various lines we've been talking about recently, it seems to me. The your starting point, Ron, about the notion that politics has something to do with Republicans and Democrats, and that you want to suggest that there is another tradition, a very different tradition, that suggests politics is something else indeed, one that you root in Aristotle. Happy to hear good words about Aristotle. That's very nice. And that tradition of politics, as you described it, of course, reaches a certain flowering in the 19th century in Karl Marx, explicitly a development of the Aristotelian notion of the community in the way that you discussed it, and is mentioned again by Noam Chomsky frequently. It's the tradition that he's working on, and he's talking about the applicability of that tradition to our present circumstance. Here's something he said recently, not all that recently at all, a good while ago, and about this question of human nature and politics as described in this Aristotelian/Marxist tradition. He speaks for the tradition of the Enlightenment, in which the central attribute of humanity is freedom. Quote, "To inquire and to create, these are the centers around which all human pursuits more or less directly involve." He's quoting here a generally unknown Enlightenment figure called Wilhelm von Humboldt. But he goes on to say, all moral culture springs solely and immediately from the inner life of the soul and can never be produced by external and artificial contrivances. The cultivation of the understanding, as of any man's other faculties, is generally achieved by his own activity, his own ingenuity, by his own methods of using the discoveries of others, close quote. And Chomsky remarks, from these arguments, quite obviously, an educational theory follows, what you alluded to, I think, at the end there, it also a good deal else follows. Humboldt, whom Chomsky is quoting, went on to develop the rudiments of a theory of exploitation and of alienated labor that suggests and feeds into the young Marx. It seems to me that when we're talking about politics today, this is the essential element, the point that we have got to attend to. The two sides that you referred to are not Republicans and Democrats. The two sides are indicated by Marx's remark that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. We've had this language repristinated for us recently in this 1%, 99% distinction that the Occupy Wall Street movement is talking about. And it seems to me that we really should recognize that and make use of it. When we talk about the other side, we don't mean the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans, or conversely, the other side means the other side of the class struggle. It's the class struggle that we're dealing with now. It's the class struggle that corrupts our politics, and we've seen that particularly visibly, I think, during this last sham election, when the construction of the election has been left in the hands of the 1%. And the rest of us suffer from it. And therefore, it finally doesn't make too much difference what happens in the election, because the game is cooked from the beginning. There's the struggle. There's the contradiction that politics is finally about. And to the extent to which people begin to realize that becomes clear, we've made some gains. It seems to me there's a lot of losses here, too, though, huh?
Yeah, this has been one of the standard talking points of the people who have thought about why socialism has not made more progress in the USA. That's because there's been this enormous interest in developing alternatives to it, some would say, going back to Frederick Jackson Turner, and the thesis of social conflict between the classes was prevented for a long time by the safety valve of the Western frontier. People who were dissatisfied with things could go west, young man, and make a career there and succeed, and so on. And then this came into conflict with the interpretation not of the frontier, but of the sections. There was no class conflict in America, it was claimed. It was a conflict between sections, as we saw in the Civil War. and trying to avoid the issue that way. But will it become clearer and clearer that the real conflict is between social classes, economic and political dominance of one group over another? And I think that's probably true. So there was a generation of what are called progressive historians: Charles Beard, Carl Becker, James Harvey Robinson, Frederick Jackson Turner, that Richard Hofstadter wrote about, who commented on this to some extent. And I think there's much in their writings that still deserves some attention. In particular, Charles A. Beard's his economic interpretation of the Constitution of 1913,
Right.
which set off a frantic effort to undercut and refute and discredit that class-based analysis of what went into the making of the Constitution.
Yeah, well, go ahead, David.
No, I'm just saying all of these are little known in what the important references that you make, Ron, are little known in relation to what we call political science. Just to affirm the fact that I speak with tongue in cheek to a certain extent, because while there may be of some value of political science at some technical level, insofar as we need to develop ways to govern ourselves in technologically complex society, I really don't see any use for political science other than the fact that people who call themselves political scientists or theorists or researchers or whatever they want to call themselves ought to be reading these classic political and historical texts, expanding on them and relating them to their students. And some of that might go on in higher ed these days. I doubt very much of it goes on to much benefit, and it certainly doesn't go on in a context in which students can relate this very important discourse to what's going on around them in the political world. And I think that's as true of, and probably more true of our campus than it is perhaps of smaller liberal arts colleges. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be pointed out that there's a political vacuum at the heart of the modern sort of corporate multiversity.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think they do have some interesting insights about a number of things that people should know about.
Yeah.
The role of political parties, for example, which are often they're often condemned, and most of the people I know are very insistent on claiming that they don't adhere to any political party. They're independents, and they make up their own mind about everything. But political parties keep arising because they do have a role. And typically, you will never be able to study any candidate's background and promises and so on enough to make a rational decision about them. But if you know that they belong to a certain party, you at least have some information about what kind of influences will come to bear upon them. And so I'd vote for the person, like everyone else, as much as I possibly can, but I know so little about a lot of people that it sometimes becomes the decisive factor which party they belong to.
It would be a great idea to have political parties, I think.
what do you think of political parties in the U.S.? It would be a very good idea.
Yeah, we were warned about them. They didn't have the terminology then. There's nothing about parties in the Constitution, but in Federalist 10, they talk about factions.
Right. And as a bad thing, as something to be avoided.
Right,
yes,
right,
exactly, right. Look, it seems to me that one of the problems here, your attack on political scientists earlier in the hour should be paralleled with an attack on American historians, who as a group are part of the same conspiracy. And the conspiracy is precisely to deny class struggle in America. The conspiracy, and I mean, this broke down some in the 1960s, but I mean, I'm old enough to have been bred up in the older tradition where one takes degrees in history in American institutions and hear about the American genius, the American exceptionalism, how from the founding of the republic to today, the U.S. has avoided class struggle, avoided all that nastiness in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and so forth. And we've done it in various ways. You mentioned the frontier thesis as being one of the ways to talk about it, and it's true. The greatest American novel, the first great American novel, ends with its principal character lighting out for the territory.
Yeah.
That is, leaving for the frontier. Huckleberry Finn goes. And Twain, who saw very well the politics of his age, it seems to me, expresses that notion. But the point at stake here is that the class struggle in America was very real, very deep, in some ways realer than it was in Europe, because there was no feudal background to which one could recur and say, yes, well, this is, we have all those sort of old traditions from the feudal era, that get in the way of modern class struggle. No, the class struggle was clearer and more available in America, and therefore had to be covered over much more. Consent had to be manufactured. Even the notion that we hear from the American history professors that the Civil War was about sectionalism, not about class, I think is manifestly false. The Civil War was directly about class, in that it was a fight between two ruling classes about their differing ways of extracting surplus value from the direct producers. They had two ways of doing it: chattel slavery in the South and wage slavery in the North. And in order to get wage slavery ticking over nicely, chattel slavery had to be destroyed. So the Civil War was about the class struggle in a peculiar and complex fashion, available to American history, in American history. By the end of the century, the end of the 19th century, Robert Baron Jay Gould can say, in America, I can always hire one half of the working class to kill the other half.
Right.
And as a result, America has a far bloodier labor history in the 19th and 20th century than Europe does. And the source of this is the suppression of class struggle in America, which in fact was successfully carried out and has been certainly in the minds of American historians, with some notable exceptions, who are then, as you mentioned in the case of Charles Beard, pilloried whenever they mention the fact that this was a class society, and the history of all hitherto existing society in America is a history of class struggle. And this is, that's not a truth that is supposed to be talked about.
Some have tried to characterize this as a struggle continuing throughout American history between the Hamiltonians on one side and the Jeffersonians on the other. And there's a bit of truth in that, too, if you want to talk about it in those terms.
And when you realize that Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian reduced to class positions in some sense,
yes.
Hamiltonians speaking for the moneyed class and Jeffersonians speaking for those sturdy yeomen, who are in fact the working class in an agricultural society, the class dimension becomes clear. But look, I mean, the conspiracy runs deeper than this. In the 1960s, in American history departments, there was a great fight over something that finally was named, and it took a long time to name it, but to talk of consensus history. Consensus history was the view among American historians that America had escaped the class struggle by establishing a consensus from the beginning that obviated the need for struggles between classes. Well, beginning in the 60s primarily, a lot of people stood up and said, hey, this is nonsense. And one of the first flowerings of the realization that this is nonsense is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. So we've had more than a generation of folks realizing that this national mythology about classlessness needs to be put aside. But it's taken things like Occupy Wall Street and so forth for us to begin to realize that there is a class dimension here which has never gone away. In fact, in some ways is far more serious now because of the 30 years of neoliberal reaction to the 1960s. So these issues are on the table, they need to be talked about, and they are the explanation of the structure of politics in America in the early 21st century.
One recent effort to revive this consensus view or to continue it, it was in a column by David Brooks this past week, in which he attempted to find to define what a moderate is in our political culture. And I think, not everybody who's attempted to argue for consensus history is as transparently silly as Brooks is, but I would recommend that as sort of a example of a recent effort, this kind of instinct to deny that there's genuine conflict, and that what our political system needs is for people to rise above conflict in various kind of philosophical ways. So, and I think there was a response to Brooks's argument on Counterpunch. I can't recall who wrote that, because it was down. Counterpunch was offline for a couple of days during the storm, but you might want to look at both of those. I don't think it was, but yeah. Anyway, so
you're watching. Yeah. You're watching news from Neptune, and we'll go to David Green for some observations.
I wanted to continue Ron's reference to Sigmund Freud in a kind of different context, just to tie it, just to segue there.
Sure.
I want to say a few words about what I feel the role of the Israel-Palestine conflict has been in the current election, presidential election campaign. And I guess the reason I don't have much to say about that is that it hasn't really been talked about very much in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict. It seems like that Israel-Palestine, strictly understood as this problem of the Israeli occupation and Palestinian resistance, has fallen off the front pages, the election campaign, and in some ways just the political consciousness, other than those people that are directly identify with that conflict from either or various sides. And I guess the reference to Freud was just sort of an attempt to say that the Israel-Palestine conflict seems to be more active as a kind of referent or sublimated reference to what's going on in other contexts in the presidential campaign. We don't hear about Israel-Palestine per se, but we hear about support for Israel vis-a-vis Iran and the alleged nuclear threat. We don't hear much about Israel-Palestine per se, but we hear about Jewish voters. And I would suggest just briefly that along the lines of what Norman Finkelstein has talked about in his most recent book, one of his two recent books, Knowing Too Much, in which he talks about the evolution of support and then the drop-off of support for Israel among Jewish people or within the populace, the Jewish American population, that there's good reason for Israel and Palestine not to be spoken of in specific terms, and for the occupation not to necessarily be spoken of in specific terms in a campaign. But there still is good reason for it to be referred to as a kind of stand-in for U.S. foreign policy, to put it, in the broad sense, in our relationship with Israel in terms of U.S. foreign policy. We can't really talk about that, but we can talk in general and vague terms about our support for this country with which we allegedly share values, but we most certainly share a lot of military equipment. And on the other hand, when the topic comes around to the Jewish voter, whether in Florida or elsewhere, again, it seems to me that, to put it in crass terms, we're not so much talking about that as we're talking about something else. I'm not quite sure what that is. I don't know whether I should be crass enough to say that when the discussion turns to Jewish voters, what we're really talking about is Jewish money. That is the money from wealthy Jewish donors to the political campaigns of either party.
Yeah, there aren't that many Jewish voters.
No, there aren't that many Jewish voters. So money must have something to do with it. But I guess I just wanted to put on the table this question of why are we talking about Israel and Palestine or why is there an assumption that that's an issue when it's really not an issue that's talked about or that seemingly can't be talked about? And I would kind of parallel that to the what I see locally has evolved over the past several years in our community and on our campus in regards to discourse of the Israel-Palestine conflict. It doesn't really exist anymore in any kind of public sense. Every so often a speaker comes through and a speaker is gone. Every so often an event is sponsored by a local group or other, whether it be Hillel or whether it be the Students for Justice in Palestine or whether it be the community sort of ecumenical group that has taken an interest in this issue. But I don't really what I don't see on campus is official intellectual discourse, other than the visit by Rashid Khalidi a couple months ago. I don't think that even the supporters of Israel, as institutionalized as support for Israel has been on our campus and in our state, from the governor on down, what we don't find is more official sort of representatives of a particularly Zionist or Israeli point of view or official point of view coming and speaking in public events on this campus where they might be exposed to criticism among those of us who have long since sort of gotten off that thing and become very, very critical of it. And I don't think it's an accident. I don't think I'm making this up. I think there's been a real backing off while the undercurrent, the sort of institutionalization goes on. But again, just as in the national campaign, nobody really wants to talk about what the issue really is because it's so stuck and it's so obvious that what's going on ultimately is that the United States, as Rashid Khalidi was arguing when he was here, the United States doesn't want a solution. It wants the peace process to go on and on and on, but it doesn't want a solution to the relationship between Israel and Palestine.
If I understand you correctly, David, to say what the problem really is to talk about American foreign policy, to talk about the fact that the essential connection is between U.S. and the state of Israel as the stationary aircraft carrier for American control of the Middle East, in a phrase that I think is Chomsky's, or as the Nixon administration said, our guard dog, our cop on the beat, right?
Right. I would call it our beachhead, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And it is I like the Freudian notion, the idea that something's being displaced here, that a conflict that can't be talked about is being moved into another area or put onto something else. Yeah. But it seems to me that the real conflict is not finally the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The conflict is between the United States and the greater Middle East, that the essential position of Israel in America's war plans for the Middle East is what gives the strength to American support for the suppression of the Palestinians, and it's been argued, and it seems to me correctly, that without that support, that suppression probably couldn't continue. You agree with that? Do you think that's so?
Yeah, well, I do, and I mean, I would have to throw in, the reference to the Israel lobby and the alleged power of the Israel lobby, that gets referred to a lot in, not directly in this campaign, but it gets referred to a lot in those that are watching it closely, people that are involved in the conflict and are directly, relate to the suffering that goes on in this conflict. The Israel lobby gets talked about a lot, but again, that seems to be another referent or another sort of way of avoiding talking about what's really going on, which is what you refer to, the idea that when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, it wasn't talked about a lot anyway because the candidates basically agree with each other. They were, in the context of Israel and Iran, they were busy trying to reassure each other reassure more than the other guy that that Israel would continue to be our best friend. And so this really, and it leaves me, I guess the thing that brings me to this partly is it leaves me wondering what those of us who've been involved in sort of arguing the Israel-Palestine conflict in various local contexts, what we're really left with, because it doesn't seem to me at this point in time it's a very active issue. I know there's many things going on many campuses, and there's little upsurge of this or that. They don't seem to go anywhere. There doesn't seem to be any critical mass for raising this issue to a level of consciousness beyond where it's already gotten. There's been tremendous changes made over the last 15, 20 years. There's a lot more understood about this, but the politics of that don't seem to go anywhere, and that's the practical issue that really concerns me in all of this. Where this is all going.
But I like the suggestion that it's part of the administration's attempt, essentially, to obfuscate what it's doing in the Middle East. We're told constantly, "Oh, the war in Iraq ended, and he's withdrawing from Afghanistan," isn't he? I mean, the fundamental lies about what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East are like night and day. I mean, the administration is trying to make sure that Americans don't notice what's going on there, and it seems to me that this is the Israel-Palestine issue becomes, in some sense, almost a subset of the lies the U.S. is telling about the Middle East, or rather the covering sin with smooth names in the Middle East that the U.S. is up to. Is that fair?
I think so. Absolutely.
Take on this, Ron?
No, I think it's a matter of the political id being raised to consciousness and the ego and subjected to the superego, perhaps, to refer to Freudian terms again. But yeah, there's a lot of merit in that, in what you said, I think.
I think it ultimately it sort of becomes a tactical issue. I mean, we live in a college community where there allegedly is always this incipient opportunity for some kind of activism, some kind of critical mass of consciousness around a particular issue. It doesn't have to be the most fundamental and important issue. It just happens to be an issue that matters, and that at least matters in the larger scheme of things, that isn't completely diversionary, such as, this Joseph Kony thing in Africa from a few months ago. I mean, these things come and go, and they tend to come and go quickly. There has been a persistent movement for social justice in Palestine for quite some time, and that movement continues to grow on college campuses around this country, but it seems to be stymied. At some level, at some fundamental level, it's stymied at taking on a larger life of its own and becoming a real active force. And I think that's what concerns me. And it isn't that I feel that those students and other community members in a community like this who educate themselves about this issue and desperately want to do something about it, who've traveled back and forth there, who've seen what's going on there. I think that can be a basis for challenging the status quo. But there's various groups doing various things, and I'm sorry to say, I don't think it's amounted to a whole lot, other than consciousness raising. So I feel like these are difficult questions that need to be asked by those people interested in the Palestinian cause and in the larger cause. Where are we going in both analyzing and actually doing something about this problem?
You're watching the last few minutes of News from Neptune. I have one item that seems to me to be particularly important from the week's news that has been remarkably ignored. I cannot believe it. And this is represented by a bit of language that appeared in a series in the Washington Post last week. The bit of language is disposition matrix. And if you haven't heard about the disposition matrix, it seems to be a wonderful illustration of how the most important news stories are cast aside and put aside, in part because of reasons that might be Freudian. That is, they're crimes that we don't want to acknowledge. And the disposition matrix is precisely that. And I'm going to feed into this Freudian avoidance by not talking about it anymore and go to something else that has to do with language. And maybe we'll come back to the most important issue of the disposition matrix the next time we meet. I say I have a bit of language to talk about because we are introducing a new feature here on News from Neptune that we call Coburn's Corner. The last publication of one of the greatest political writers of our generation, Alexander Cockburn, is called Guillotined, as in the French Revolution, you know, chop off. In this pamphlet, and it's not much more than that, Cockburn set out to save the English language from abuse by journalists, politicians, and bloggers. So says his co-editor at Counterpunch, Jeffrey Sinclair. Over a series of columns, Cockburn lined up a most wanted list of cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words, and consigned them to execution. In his typically sharp prose, he inveighed against the corruption, debasement of political speech, particularly ridiculing the use of hackneyed terms like national conversation, international community, and sustainable development. The pamphlet, and the pamphlet's available, by the way, if you want it from the Counterpunch people, was literally written on Cockburn's deathbed. But the prose is as fiery as ever, and it is funny as well. And we are going to try to honor his memory by coming up with some other examples that we want to throw under the tumbril to take off to the guillotine of language, political language, that obfuscates, and perhaps in fine Freudian fashion, what's actually going on, that covers over the crimes that are really being committed. And Ron, you got a nomination for being frog marched into the tumbril?
Sure. Well, some of my nominations for the extreme haircut would be war on this and war on that, which has become the lazy cliche for every kind of conflict or questioning or whatever that's going on. These are the most hackneyed phrases in present-day journalism, taking a substitute for careful, I think, analytical thought. Hard-earned money. Everybody's money is hard-earned, it seems. I don't know, is my money hard-earned?
They don't want us to talk about if those people whose money is soft-earned.
Yeah, right.
Not if you're in the 43%, 47%.
Right.
But the most annoying one recently has been captured the imagination of the public. Did anything capture your imagination recently? Go to the mat.
I like that.
Push back. Disingenuous. It's being used a lot.
Oh, dear, yes.
Yeah, and I'm not sure people who are using it.
I think Cockburn even mentions that at one point in the pamphlet.
Right. Once popular, gravitas.
Oh, dear.
People were, politicians were condemned for not having gravitas.
You don't think gravitas is sunk of its own weight?
Right. Did Sarah Palin lack gravitas? Right.
That was a verbe de pois, I thought.
Yeah, right. Those are just a few. Actually, I had another list of them somewhere, and I don't know where it is.
Well,
but,
we'll continue Cockburn's Corner as the returns come in, so to speak, on the bad use of language in our politics. David, you got some examples?
Well, the one thing that comes to mind, not because it's wrong, but just because it's overused, is, and this is a whole irony in even saying this, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. It's been overused. In other words, it's getting the same result.
Right.
And so it may apply. I don't know if Einstein really said this. It's attributed to Einstein. Maybe Einstein would like it if we stopped saying it. And I guess the only other thing I would add to that, and this isn't well, it isn't. It's broader than politicians, but really want to be prayed for, and
Oh, stop, David. Come on.
I mean, it's become a litany, a kind of, no pun intended.
Yes,
a litany, quite literally.
For whenever something is going on, that people have to assert that they are praying for the people in need, or praying for the people suffering under Hurricane Sandy or whatever. And I would like to help people, and I would like to have a government that helps people. I would like to have to not pray for them. I would like to have to know that somebody's doing something, or myself is doing something, rather than simply praying for them. I think it's become a kind of a way of expressing a kind of smarmy religiosity that I fear, and unfortunately do not pray that it will be with us for quite some time.
This is harsh of you, David, on All Souls Day, which November 2nd happens to be. But
Well,
hey, there we are.
Well, bless your heart, David.
God love you, David, as I used to say in Boston.
Bless your little black heart, right?
I want to get my candidate in on this list. These are wonderful, and we'll have more. Coburn's Corner will be a regular feature on News from Neptune. My example for this week is Going Forward, a Britishism that you may not hear, but here's a line from the Financial Times this week. Quote, "Going forward, U.S. companies that have high labor costs that cannot be removed offshore will be in a substantial strategic disadvantage to their competitors." Going forward? Were we going back? What was going on here? Going forward stands sort of in the future, or from now on, so forth and so on, and is just a verbal tick, except for the fact I hear under it the sort of thing that Chomsky has condemned under the name of the doctrine of change of course. And that's when you condemn something that a government or business or whatever is doing and say, oh, well, that was then, this is now. Going forward, we're not going to have to worry about it. So get rid of going forward to the tumbrel.
At this point in time, we're going forward.
Yeah, exactly. That's, I think it's a way to try to not have to think about the fact that the CIA tortured people and is still doing it, because we're going forward. You've been watching News from Neptune for November 2nd in the 44th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky, and this has been the Election Results Edition, where we discovered that no matter who is elected president in our quadrennial quadrille, the U.S. government's murderous military and economic policies will not change substantially, because in America, policy is insulated from politics. If our program interests you, you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org/livestream. I'm Carl Estabrook, and my discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of the program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com, and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I'm happy to receive your comments, and let us know if you'd ever like to sit in for one of our regulars when they're not available. Our thanks particularly to UPTV, Jake, Jason, and Caleb at the top of the list, and we will be back, inshallah, next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge, and in the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.